ready to continue the last half of lesson number 6. And we begin at a point where the Founding Fathers began after they had settled down and were ready for the Constitutional Convention to really get into operation. I wanted you to have the experience of going through some of the brainstorming that they had to go through to reach some of their conclusions that turned out to be just remarkably clean-cut and logical, rational, morally sound. And so we're going to go through just a few of the highlights, and you'll see how it went back and forth. It wasn't easy to come to many of these conclusions. So will you start now with 6a, Roman numeral 6a. They had to decide now whether we should have a confederation of the states or should we have a national government of all the people. And national is your blank. Now Madison said we can do both. And in the 45th Federalist paper, he sets forth how they ended up. They ended up with a confederation of states in the national government representing all the people. So it was a beautiful combination with a separation of powers. And in your outline, I've put in one of the most important passages in the entire document called the Federalist Papers, where Madison said, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined." Now they're going to do the things that all of the states have a national interest in having accomplished. Fight wars, engage in treaties with foreign nations, handle foreign commerce, etc., and keep interstate commerce flowing, which the states have been reluctant to do. They keep trying to capitalize on any exclusive thing they have, like cotton or machinery. California later on, oranges. See how it goes? All right. It says the powers reserved to the states. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. That's where most of the problems must be solved. Don't get these things up on the federal level. The powers reserved to the states will extend to all of the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Now what the Founding Fathers were saying was this: you're going to need some regulatory agencies, but keep them close to you so that you can go down the street and say, "Hey, Joe, this isn't working out. This zoning program you've got is just choking us to death. It isn't really practical for a town this size. You've got something that would be appropriate for a big city like New York. Now let's talk this thing over." And see, that's so much easier than having come out of Washington, where you've got to hire an attorney to go back there and you spend all your money and very often don't get anywhere. The Founding Fathers said regulations out of your national government are too big, too far away, and when they abuse you, which regulatory agencies, because they're human beings, always do, you won't have a handle big enough to turn it off. Nobody knows that better than the American people in the year 1980. Their warning all came to pass. All right. Which powers should be entrusted to the central government? And they thrashed it out all during these 4 months and ended up with 20, and that's your blank. Now, what kind of representation do you want? Do you just want a House of Representatives, or do you also want a Senate? A Senate, that's your blank. Now, what's a Senate for? Now let's talk this out the way the founders did, because a Senate today is a completely different body than the founders intended, because of the 17th Amendment. So first of all, the role of the Senate is to represent the states as sovereign entities. Therefore, because they are representing the states, they are not elected by the people, the founders said. They are appointed by the state legislatures, and that's number 2, the state legislatures. And so when the man goes back to the Senate, all the time that he's voting, he's thinking, well, now, what will my friends who've sent me back here from the state of Kansas or California, what will they think now about my vote? All right, now you see how that's been changed by the 17th Amendment, because people started saying, no, let's have the senators elected by the people. Now you notice what happens. Now the senator is saying, ooh, let's see, we can vote for these funds to come into our state They're going to be so great, and we'll pour money into the schools and into the farms, and the first thing you know, nobody is saying, wait a minute, that money is being spent in violation of our state's rights. Who's saying it? See what happened? Both the Congress and the senators now being elected by the people, and that depends upon pleasing the people. Money always pleases the people, and all of a sudden no one was speaking up on behalf of states' rights. All right? Capital D, should the House of Representatives be based on total population including slaves? Slaves are your blank. Well, the South said, of course, they're people, right? So the South said yes. Now, a little later on, they said, all right, now we're going to allocate taxes according to each state based on their population. And the South said, well, of course, you wouldn't want to count slaves for that purpose. The North said, no, wait a minute. I thought you said they were people. Well, they are, but they're not taxpayers, and that just isn't fair. Well, they started to argue about it a little bit, and Madison said, look, let's compromise the idea of representation and taxes, and let's just say that they each represent 3/5 of a vote. Now, that wasn't demeaning to the slaves, as many people have pretended. It was simply a compromise between representation and taxes for those who were in a state of bondage. Everybody follow that? And so number 2 is no, and number 3 is 3/5. All right, capital E. Who shall be qualified to vote in the election of a federal official? And these men said, we've got to leave that up to the states. They will decide who can vote for a congressman and a senator, and it will be, as it turned out in the Constitution, anyone who can vote for a member of your state legislature can vote for a federal representative. So it's state for capital E. Now, should the Congress be forbidden to exercise certain powers? Well, nobody ever restricts a legislature. I mean, it passes the laws, but the founders said there's some things Congress shouldn't do ever. And so the answer is yes. And that's going to be Article 1, Section 9. We're going to get to that one. All right, what about restricting the states? Are there some things the states should never, ever do? Right. And so that one is yes, and that will be in Section 10 that we'll be covering very shortly. You see, what we're doing is going through the Constitution phrase by phrase, and this will give a lot of meaning to those particular provisions when we come to them. Okay, capital H. How many presidents? Well, James Wilson said, what we want is a strong, single president. Oh, my goodness, Randolph was on his feet immediately. Shades of King George, we want at least 3 presidents. One to represent New England, one to represent the Middle States, one to represent the South. Safety in numbers, you know. And James Wilson's back on his feet. Safety in numbers, man. Haven't you heard of the 30 tyrants of Greece? I mean, they all combined, put it all together. There's no safety in numbers. What you need is a single strong president, functioning within a framework of limited power, so that when it's time for him to act, he can act with strength in the name of all the people. Well, that's where they ended up, isn't it? All right, so your first blank is single, and then 3. Well, how should the president be elected? My, that was amazing. They finally decided it probably should be by the House and the Senate. That's the way they first voted. Later on, they set up the Electoral College, but they started out suggesting the House and the Senate in the Virginia resolutions. Before they were through, it took 60 ballots trying to decide how to elect the president. Capital J. How long should the president serve? Well, they looked at George Washington. They'd like to have him as long as he lasted. They'd like to have him for life. Hamilton especially recommended that President Washington be there for life. But they ended up with 4 years because they did realize that after Washington there would be someone else. And they looked around at one another and they thought, well, 4 years is enough. All right, should the president serve more than 1 term? The majority voted for 1 term, but they noticed George Washington voted against it. And they said to themselves, he needs more than 1 term, I guess. So they didn't put anything in the Constitution. But Washington only served 2 terms, and that became the pattern clear down to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served 4 terms, and then the 22nd Amendment was passed so that that wouldn't happen again. A president can only serve 2 terms now. Washington voted against 1 term, and then they didn't put anything in the Constitution about it as a result. And the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms. All right, capital L. Who should serve as the referee to see that the Constitution is enforced according to the original intent? Well, now that's Parliament in England. Parliament passes the law, judges its law, and decides whether it's constitutional. And they're almost unlimited in their power. Parliament. Now, the founders left it pretty much to each of the branches of government to decide. It was left a little fluid, but in due time it gravitated to the Supreme Court as a result of the work of George Marshall and some others. Now, the abuse of judicial power under that arrangement has been such that when we get over to Article 3, we have suggested an amendment to protect us from some abuses which have been occurring, particularly in the past 20 years. The referee got in on the act so that they were playing on one team against the American people there for a while. All right, now here are actually the highlights of the convention. We're going to zip right along here as we go through these actual highlights of what happened once they got going. I wanted you to, first of all, just kind of consider what it would have been like if you'd sat there for 4 months hashing out these kind of problems we've just mentioned. Tell you they were great men, and they really needed the inspiration of God to help them find it. Once or twice they kind of forgot and thought they were on their own. And we'll come to that in a minute. Franklin kind of reminded them that where their real source of power lay. From May the 30th to June the 13th, the convention discussed the 15 Virginia resolves, one at a time, very carefully and succinctly, one at a time. Now, they had barely gotten through, and they did an interesting thing. They would take all of the things they could agree upon, and then they'd pass those. If it was something they were going to argue about, they said, all right, we'll put that up to a little further, and then they'd go on and on and on. So they had quite a few laid aside. You see, they haven't even decided yet. They voted on all the things they could agree upon. As soon as they finished the 15th resolve, here's a good old William Patterson of New Jersey, and he said, if you'll just give us the rest of the day off, we small states would like to present a brand new plan. Oh, no. Yes, new plan. So that's your blank, new. Now, the New Jersey plan was laid before the convention the following day, Friday, June the 15th. And William Patterson said the smaller states wanted to scrap the Virginia resolutions altogether and start all over again, just amending the Articles of Confederation. Oh my, there were some groans among the bigger states, Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, etc. So the following day, James Wilson of Pennsylvania said, gentlemen, let me just compare these two plans for the benefit of them. And these are direct quotes now that I've given you in your outline. He said the Virginia plan proposes 2 branches in the legislature. 2. The New Jersey plan, a single legislative body. He said, I just want to put these 2 plans in contrast so you can see what's happened. Virginia plan, the one that we presented, or that they presented from Virginia, has all power emanating from the people, the whole people. The New Jersey plan says that it emanates from the states. Virginia wants a single executive, and New Jersey wants several. Virginia says a majority of the legislature can act on all national problems and issues. Majority. The New Jersey plan says only a minority of things can even be considered by the Congress under any circumstances. And a minority can control, too. And Virginia has it says the legislature can legislate on all national concerns, that's all. And New Jersey only on limited objects. Virginia legislature says let's have the power to negate any laws that are passed by the states, which would be in violation of the federal Constitution. Now, Congress doesn't do that. As it turned out, that's the job of the Supreme Court. But that was the original plan. And New Jersey wanted to give the federal government the authority to make war against any state that didn't comply. That's why we just make war against that state. And Virginia said we ought to be able to remove the president by impeachment through the Congress if the president gets out of line. New Jersey said, no, the states ought to be able to remove him if a majority of the state legislatures move to say to remove the president, out he goes. Then Virginia was in favor of the establishment of inferior federal courts, a whole system of federal courts to handle federal problems. And you'll see that turns out to be very important. The New Jersey plan didn't have any provision for that. All right? Now, while the convention was thinking about these two plans, just think, up jumps Alexander Hamilton. He said, I got a new plan. Now they're really groaning. Yeah, here's Hamilton. He was a brilliant man, had a lot of courage. He's the one that worked so hard to get this convention, as you know. And so capital E is Hamilton. Now he says, I don't think we should tread in untried waters. Why don't we go back to the British system? That's what I'd like to have. Let's go back to the British system. So let's elect an executive for life, just like a king. How's that? So your first one is life. And then number 2, he said, and let's elect our senators for life too. That's a good idea. Like the House of Lords, you know? And number 3, the House of Representatives will have representatives elected for 3 years only. 3 years. And then he said, I'd like to have the federal government appoint the governors of all the states. That's what I'd like to see. Just like we had it before the Revolutionary War when King George appointed all our royal governors. That's what I'd like to see. So he had the federal government playing the role of a king. So number 3 is 3. Number 4 is federal. Now, Madison makes a very interesting comment in his notes after Hamilton's great speech. It was brilliant. I mean, he reasoned it through. He said, this plan has worked pretty well. And we're just jumping off into something we don't know anything about here in in the plans of New Jersey and Virginia. Let's go back. The British plan has been tried. And so Madison says his speech was approved, meaning applauded, by all and supported by none. It was not even discussed, let alone being voted upon. All right, on June the 19th, a moving speech was given by James Madison, that's capital F, in which he said, the convention must come up with a constitution for the ages. Please remember that. That's the way these men were thinking. Whatever we do now, this has got to last forever. This is a constitution for the ages. And the New Jersey plan won't do it. The British plan didn't do it. The Virginia resolutions come the closest to providing what Jefferson and many of the rest of us have studied out carefully. It'll serve humanity forever. And so they voted out the New Jersey plan completely. And they didn't even talk about Hamilton's plan. They abandoned it, and even Hamilton abandoned it and left for New York. He just left. He did come back right at the end of the convention. But a little later on, he's criticized for suggesting some things as Secretary of the Treasury, and Madison says, you should have stayed for the rest of the convention. You missed a lot of important points. All right. Now, from June the 19th, the convention after June the 19th, see, we've kind of settled this. We've gone through the Virginia resolutions, and we've gotten rid of the New Jersey plan. We've abandoned Hamilton's plan. And now we go into the discussion of those tough questions that they'd set aside. You remember? All right. This is called the crisis period of the convention. Crisis period. It lasted clear up until July the 26th. July the 26th. Now, it was during all the quarreling and heated debate that we had a rather remarkable thing happen. Benjamin Franklin said, there's something wrong with this convention. All this quarreling and all this bickering, all of us pretending to have wisdom we obviously don't have. And so he made his petition for prayer. And it's so beautiful. I just want to read these couple of paragraphs. He says, I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that built it. I firmly believe this. I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. And so now drop down. He says, I therefore beg leave to move, that hereafter prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations, be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to do business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. There's a grand old man that had learned the most elementary fact of life, that human beings are frail and very dependent on the Creator and His inspiration and guidance. And then somebody remembered they didn't have any money to pay the clergy. Well, Franklin himself had written some beautiful prayers, but then they didn't think that was probably fair. And since they didn't have any money, why, they never did have prayers publicly. But Madison said that was a very sobering speech. And we all went humbly about the task. It didn't settle all the disputes or anything like that, but they determined to stay in there and tenaciously work for a constitution for the ages. So it had its effect, even though they didn't take any formal action on it. All right, capital on I. Another valley of shadow enveloped the convention between let's see, July the 10th and July the 16th. July the 10th and July the 16th. They just, to give you an idea how a travail that was, they, as I mentioned earlier, just trying to decide how to elect the president took 60 ballots. 60 ballots. Now, Washington at this time, right at when it was most difficult, said, I almost despair of seeing the issue, seeing a favorable issue, meaning a conclusion to the proceedings of the convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business. Now, I want to tell you, that great man was in a very low spirit to say something like that. People that were with him said that he looked as grim at this stage of the convention as he did at Valley Forge. He just decided these men weren't capable of coming to a consensus or structuring a sound government. All right, it was on this date, July the 10th, the two remaining delegates from New York, Lansing and Yates, left the convention and never returned. Never came back. All right. Capital J. Nevertheless, a big breakthrough came on July the 16th, when the convention finally agreed to a formula for representation in Congress. I tell you, they had argued about that, and here's the reason why. Representation is your blank under J. All right, number one, the small states were determined to have just one vote for each state. They were sovereign. They came into the Confederation as sovereign individuals, so some were big and some were little. That's irrelevant. They were individual sovereign states, and they each wanted a vote. Well, now, the big states said, actually, that isn't fair. It ought to be in terms of population. And Georgia jumped up and says, if you do that, Pennsylvania will have 16 times more representatives than Georgia. And Madison said, and if we just have one vote for each state, a citizen in Georgia has 16 times more representation than a citizen of Pennsylvania. I just kind of think that one through. So anyway, they hassled it back and forth, and finally, both sides finally agreed to accept the suggestion of Roger Sherman of Connecticut that each state have equal representation in the Senate, but that the House of Representation should be according to population. All right? All right, now July 26th, they said, okay, that's basically all we need. Now let's turn it over to Committee on Detail and let's write a constitution now. Let's put all these resolutions together. And so that's the Committee on Detail. And so that committee reported back on the 6th of August. And it took them from the 6th of August to September the 8th to take all of the points, now that they'd set them down in a constitution, and put them through the refining process. And that's your blank, refining. Refining. All right, now that they'd come to pretty much what they wanted to do, on September the 8th, they turned it over to a committee on style, and that's your blank, style. And the man that did the actual writing of most of the Constitution was Gouverneur Morris, not Governor Morris, Gouverneur Morris, that's his name, French name, M-O-R-R-I-S. Now, after the new draft was finished and it's in beautiful language and was presented, guess what? There were some few people that still wanted to bring up about 18 additional little trivia, and the majority said, look, don't tamper with it. Don't trifle with it. All of the main things have been settled. And let's go ahead on this basis, and then there are always amendment processes if the people want to put it in there. So 18 is N. And on Monday, September the 17th, 1787, 13 out of the original 55 delegates were there to sign. Now that was a tremendous thing. A tremendous thing, it seems to me. Now, these wonderful men, as they were signing this, they found that 3 didn't want to do it. And they were Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, George Mason of Virginia, and Governor Edmund Randolph. And there are a lot of interesting details here we'll be picking up a little later on. Their main objection was that the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, and that's your blank. Now, Madison watched each of the men as they signed. And he writes in his record that when Franklin came up to sign, he says, the old man wept. He didn't think they could do it, but they did. The old man wept. After all they'd gone through, they actually did it, wept. And just as the last delegates were signing, Franklin referred to a picture of the sun on the back of George Washington's chair, and he said, I've often in the course of the session looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. Well, I'll tell you, as this famous convention came to a close, the founders knew that they had won a great battle, and yet they knew that it had to go to Congress, and it had to go to the people, and then it had to be tried out. So planting this great charter of freedom in the hearts and the minds of the people was a battle yet to be won. And that's what we're going to talk about in our lesson number 7, and it's called the baptism of fire. And that is a most interesting lesson. Thank you very much.